The cold was a physical thing, a weight that settled in the bones and refused to be moved. It clung to the iron of the hitching posts and laid a brittle sheet of ice over the mud-rutted street of redemption. Inside the gunsmith's shop, the air was hardly warmer, thick with the scent of gun oil, old dust, and the stale sweat of men who had nowhere else to be. 3 of them were hunched over the pot-bellied stove, their laughter a harsh, rattling sound that did nothing to warm the room. They stopped when the door opened, letting in a swirl of fine, sharp snow. She stood in the doorway, a figure cut from shadow and ice. A black cowboy hat sat low on her brow, its brim dusted with white. A black duster, worn at the cuffs and collar, fell over a black shirt and trousers tucked into scuffed boots. The only thing not black was the smooth porcelain skin of her face and the long, straight hair that fell like a sheet of polished jet down her back. Her dark, almond-shaped eyes took in the room in a single sweeping glance. The men by the stove, the long counter of scarred wood, and the man behind it. The shopkeeper, a fleshy man named Grimes with a stained apron and eyes that were too small for his face, watched her approach. His lips curled into a smile that was more of a sneer. He wiped a greasy hand on his apron and leaned on the counter, a parody of welcome. The men by the stove snickered, their amusement a low, rumbling threat. She ignored them. Her movements were deliberate, economical, as if she had learned long ago not to waste a single ounce of energy. She placed a small, near-empty canvas sack on the counter. The clink of the few remaining coins inside was swallowed by the oppressive silence. "A box of 44s, she said. Her voice was low, without accent, but quiet, as if she were unused to speaking. Grimes poked the sack with a thick finger. "That won't cover it." He looked her up and down, a slow and insulting appraisal. "Not even close. Maybe you got something else to trade?" The men by the stove laughed outright now, a chorus of mean-spirited glee. She did not flinch. She did not look at them. Her gaze remained fixed on Grimes, her expression as still and unreadable as a frozen pond. She had seen this look in 100 towns, on 1,000 faces. It was the casual cruelty of men who saw her as a curiosity, a stray, something to be either used or discarded. They saw her face, her clothes, her solitude, and assumed weakness. It was a mistake they were always so eager to make. "I have the money," she said, her voice dropping even lower, colder than the air outside. She reached into an inner pocket of her duster, her movements slow and measured. Grimes's eyes followed her hand, a flicker of greed in their depths. "Let's see it, then." Instead of a purse, her hand emerged holding a silver dollar. It was old, worn smooth, but it shone with a clean light in the grimy shop. She placed it on the counter, a sharp metallic sound against the wood. It was more than enough. Grimes stared at the coin, then back at her. The sneer on his face faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion, then suspicion. A woman like her, dressed in rags, shouldn't have clean silver. "Where'd you get that?" he demanded, his tone shifting from predatory to accusatory. "I earned it," she replied, her voice flat. "The bullets." He hesitated, his little eyes narrowing. He picked up the coin, bit it, then tossed it in the air and caught it. The finality of the sound seemed to satisfy him. He turned, grumbling, and lumbered toward the shelves behind him. He took his time, making her wait. It was another small assertion of power. She waited. Patience was a weapon she had honed to a razor's edge. He finally returned, slamming a small, plain box of cartridges on the counter, well out of her reach. "There," he grunted. "Now get on out of here." She reached for the box. He slapped his meaty hand down on top of it, covering it completely. "I changed my mind," he said, his smile returning, uglier than before. "The price went up. That dollar covers the box. Your hat covers the rest." The men at the stove stirred, sensing sport. One of them, a lanky man with a missing tooth, got to his feet and sauntered over. "Yeah," he drawled. "A pretty hat like that ought to stay in redemption." Her hand, which had been reaching for the box, did not retract. It simply stopped, hovering in the space between them. For a long moment she said nothing. The silence in the shop became taut, a string pulled to its breaking point. Her eyes, which had been calm and distant, now focused on Grimes with an intensity that made the big man shift his weight. She had not moved a muscle, yet the entire atmosphere of the room had changed. The air grew heavy, charged with a danger that the men were too slow, too arrogant to recognize. Then she moved. It wasn't fast, but it was so fluid, so impossibly smooth, that it seemed to happen outside of time. Her hand dropped from the counter, and when it came back up, it was holding a Colt revolver. It was not new. The bluing was worn thin along the barrel, and the grips were scarred, but it sat in her hand with the easy familiarity of a well-loved tool. She did not cock it. She did not need to. She simply leveled it, the barrel pointing directly at the space between Grimes's small, surprised eyes. The men by the stove froze. The lanky man took a half step back, his smirk gone, replaced by a slack-jawed disbelief. Grimes stared at the unwavering muzzle of the gun. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple. "Now, hold on," he stammered, his voice losing its bluster. "No need for that." "My hat," she said, her voice still quiet, but now it carried the chilling authority of death. "And my bullets." The shop door creaked open again. No one turned. All eyes were fixed on the woman and the gun in her hand. A man stepped inside, bringing another gust of frigid air with him. He was dressed simply in a sheepskin coat and worn denim, his face weathered by wind and sun. He took in the scene, the terrified shopkeeper, the frozen men, and the woman in black, steady as stone, holding the revolver with an expert's grip. He stopped just inside the door, his body going utterly still. His eyes, a pale, clear gray, did not look at Grimes or the gun. They looked at her. He saw the line of her shoulders, the perfect balance in her stance, the way her thumb rested near the hammer. He saw not a frightened woman pushed too far, but a professional at her work. And in that frozen moment, his expression was not one of shock or fear or even judgment. It was one of profound, startling recognition. The shopkeeper, seeing a potential ally, found his voice. "Jonah, you see this? This witch pulled a gun on me." The man named Jonah did not respond to Grimes. His gaze remained on her. He took a slow step forward, his boots quiet on the dusty floorboards. He held his hands out slightly from his sides, palms open, a gesture of peace. The tension in the room coiled tighter. She did not waver, her eyes never leaving Grimes, but she was aware of the newcomer, of his stillness, of the way he watched her with an unnerving calm. He was different from the others. He was not assessing her as a prize or a threat, but as an equal. "He can have the coin," Jonah said, his voice a low baritone, calm and steady. "Let him keep it. I'll cover the ammunition." She flickered her gaze to him for a fraction of a second. His face was unreadable, his gray eyes holding hers without challenge. He was offering a way out, a de-escalation, but it was not offered from a place of pity. It was a tactical suggestion, a quiet acknowledgement of the reality of the situation. A dead shopkeeper would bring a world of trouble, no matter how deserved. Grimes, emboldened by another man's presence, started to puff up his chest again. "She ain't getting nothing." The hammer of her Colt clicked back. The sound was deafening in the silence. It was the sound of a final decision being made. Grimes's face went pale, his jowls trembling. He slowly, deliberately lifted his hand from the box of cartridges. He slid it across the counter toward her. Then, with a shaking hand, he pushed her hat after it. She never took her eyes off him. With her free hand, she swept the box into her duster pocket and settled the hat back on her head, pulling the brim low. She began to back away toward the door, the revolver still trained on Grimes's chest. Jonah stood aside, clearing her path. As she passed him, their eyes met again. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't approval, it was understanding. She reached the door, pulled it open, and slipped out into the biting wind, disappearing as quietly as she had arrived. The men in the shop finally let out a collective breath. Grimes sank onto a stool behind the counter, wiping his face with a trembling hand. "Crazy," the lanky man muttered, finding his voice. "Plumb crazy." Jonah turned and walked to the counter. He placed a few coins on the scarred wood, more than enough to cover the bullets. "She left you the silver dollar," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You came out ahead." Grimes glared at him. "You should have helped me. We could have taken her." Jonah looked at the shopkeeper, and for the first time, a sliver of ice entered his gaze. "No," he said, the word flat and final. "We couldn't have." He turned and walked out of the shop, the bell above the door giving a single, mournful clang. Outside, the snow was falling harder. He scanned the street. He saw her tracks, small and neat, leading away from the center of town, toward the desolate, frozen expanse of the plains. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his gut, that he was going to follow them. It was not a choice. It was an inevitability. He found her a mile out of town, huddled in the scant shelter of a rock outcropping as the wind howled around her. Her horse, a lean, resilient-looking Mustang, stood with its back to the gale. She had a small fire going, the flames struggling for life against the snow. She wasn't surprised to see him. When his shape emerged from the swirling white, she simply watched him approach, her hand resting near the butt of her holstered revolver. He stopped a respectful distance from her fire, not wanting to crowd her space. "The storm's getting worse," he said, his words nearly snatched away by the wind. "My place isn't far. It's warm." She studied his face, searching for the trick, the angle. There was always an angle. But his expression was open, his gray eyes steady. He looked tired, like a man who had seen his share of the world's ugliness and had no desire to add to it. He was not offering charity. He was offering shelter, a simple, practical transaction against the brutality of the winter. "Why?" she asked, the single word sharp. "Because nobody should die in a blizzard if they don't have to," he answered simply. He gestured back the way he had come, but at an angle, away from the town. "It's just over that rise, a cabin. Nothing much, but the roof is sound." She considered his offer. The fire was failing. Her supplies were low. Another night in the open might be her last. This man had seen her at her most dangerous and had not judged her, had not tried to interfere, had only understood. It was a rarer commodity than clean silver. She gave a curt nod, then efficiently smothered the small fire with snow. She swung up onto her horse with a practiced grace. He led the way, his own horse plodding steadily through the deepening drifts. The journey was silent, the world reduced to the shriek of the wind and the white curtain of falling snow. The cabin, when they reached it, was exactly as he had described. It was small, rough-hewn, and looked as if it had been built by one man's hands. It was not much, but as the door closed behind them, shutting out the storm, it felt like a fortress. Inside, a stone fireplace dominated one wall. A simple table, 2 chairs, a bed in the corner, and a few shelves of supplies were the only furnishings. It was the sparse home of a man who owned little and needed less. He moved with quiet competence, lighting a lamp and coaxing the embers in the fireplace back to life. Soon a real fire was crackling, throwing welcome heat into the small room. He put a pot of coffee on to boil without a word. She stood by the door, dripping snow onto the floorboards, watching him. She did not take off her hat or her duster. Trust was a slow thaw. "There's stew," he said, nodding toward a pot on the hearth. "You're welcome to it." She finally moved, taking off her hat and placing it on a peg by the door. She unbuckled her gun belt and hung it beside the hat, a gesture of temporary peace. She sat at the table, her back to the wall, and accepted the bowl of stew he offered. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind outside. The stew was hot and filling, and a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire began to spread through her. It was the simple, profound comfort of being safe, of not being watched by hungry eyes. The days that followed fell into a quiet rhythm dictated by the unrelenting winter. The blizzard raged for 2 days, trapping them inside the cabin. They spoke little, but a language of shared tasks emerged. She would rise early, her movements quiet, and have the coffee ready when he woke. He would go out to feed his 2 horses and chop wood, never asking for her help, but accepting it when she wordlessly joined him, her small frame surprisingly strong as she swung an axe. They moved around each other in the small space with an unconscious grace, a silent understanding of boundaries. He never asked her name, and she never asked his. They were Lynn and Jonah, only in the quiet of their own minds. He never asked where she came from or where she was going. He never mentioned what happened in the gun shop. It was as if their lives had begun the moment he walked into the cabin behind her and shut the door on the storm. One afternoon, when the snow had finally stopped, he was mending a piece of tack by the fire. She sat opposite him, cleaning her revolver with methodical care, the pieces laid out on a piece of oilcloth. "You handle that like you were born with it," he observed, his voice casual, not probing. She clicked the cylinder back into place, the sound crisp and final. "You learn what you have to," she said, her voice soft. It was the most she had offered about her past. He nodded, accepting the answer for what it was. "Most people out here do." A fragile trust began to form in the space between their silences. She found herself watching him when he didn't know it, noticing the way his hands were gentle with the horses, the quiet focus in his eyes when he worked. He was a man who was comfortable with himself, who carried a stillness that she, who had been running for so long, found both foreign and deeply calming. He, in turn, saw the fierce intelligence in her eyes, the resilience that was etched into the lines of her face. He saw a survivor who had been forced to become a fighter. He recognized the profound loneliness in her, for it mirrored his own. The threat, when it came, was not from the winter, but from the town they had both left behind. Grimes had not forgotten his humiliation. His pride, festering in the smoky confines of his shop, had turned to a poisonous rage. He saw the quiet man Jonah as a collaborator, and the woman as a prize that had been stolen from him. He gathered the men from the stove, plying them with whiskey and promises of the silver dollars she had carried, and more he imagined she must have hidden. One evening, as dusk was bleeding purple and orange across the snow-covered landscape, they came. Jonah saw them first, 3 figures on horseback cresting the rise, dark silhouettes against the dying light. He didn't have to be told who they were. "Inside," he said to Lynn, his voice low and urgent. She was already moving, grabbing her gun belt from the peg. They barred the door and shuttered the single window just as the first shout came from outside. "We know you're in there, cowboy. Send out the China doll and we'll let you be." It was Grimes's voice, thick with liquor and malice. Jonah moved to one side of the door, his rifle in hand. Lynn took the other side, her revolver feeling heavy and familiar in her palm. The cabin, which had been a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. "They think we're easy prey," Jonah murmured, more to himself than to her. "A lone man and a woman." "They are mistaken," Lynn said, her voice a blade of ice. The first shot splintered the wood of the door. The siege had begun. They fired back sparingly, making every shot count. The attackers were sloppy, emboldened by drink and the belief that they held all the power. But inside the cabin, two people moved with a deadly, synchronized efficiency. They didn't need to speak. They reloaded in the dark, they covered each other's movements, they fought as a single unit forged in the crucible of shared silence. The fight was short and brutal. One of the men went down with a cry. Another, losing his nerve, fled into the darkness. Grimes, enraged and drunk, made a final, foolish charge at the door. Jonah's rifle cracked once. The silence that followed was absolute. In the aftermath, the cabin was a wreck. The door was splintered, the window shattered, letting in the freezing night air. A dark shape lay still in the snow outside. Jonah stood in the middle of the room, breathing heavily. He looked at the damage, at the violation of his quiet world. He looked at Lynn, her face smudged with gunpowder, her eyes dark and fierce in the lamplight. She had not hesitated. She had stood with him. He ran a hand through his hair, a deep sigh escaping him. "This changes things," he said. "He was a fool, but he'll have friends. They'll come looking." He looked at the broken door, then at the meager supplies on his shelves. A decision settled in his eyes. "This place isn't safe anymore. There's somewhere else we can go." He took a lantern and led her out into the cold, past the still form in the snow. He didn't lead her toward the horses, but toward a sheer rock face behind the cabin, a place that looked like a dead end. He pushed aside a thick growth of frozen brush to reveal a narrow opening, a fissure in the rock barely wide enough for a person to pass through. "This way," he said, stepping into the darkness. She hesitated for only a second before following him. The passage was cold and tight, the lantern light throwing their shadows against the stone walls. It smelled of damp earth and deep cold. After a few 100 feet, the tunnel began to widen and slope upward. She could feel a change in the air, a sense of open space ahead. They emerged from the tunnel onto a high, sheltered ledge, and she stopped, the breath catching in her throat. Below them, nestled in a valley she never knew existed, was a world. A vast ranch spread out under the moonlight, shielded on all sides by the towering granite cliffs they had just passed through. A large, 2-story ranch house, built of dark timber and stone, stood at its heart, its windows glowing with a warm, steady light. Smoke curled from 2 massive stone chimneys. A huge barn stood nearby, and in the sprawling, snow-dusted pastures she could see the dark shapes of hundreds, maybe thousands of cattle, protected from the wind in the valley's natural embrace. This was not the holding of a poor homesteader. This was an empire hidden in the heart of the wilderness. Jonah came to stand beside her, his gaze on the valley below. "I'm sorry for the deception," he said, his voice quiet. "The cabin, it's a test. A way to see what people are when they think you have nothing to give them. Most fail." She turned to look at him. He was the same man, dressed in the same worn clothes, but the context of everything had shifted. The quiet man with nothing was a king in a hidden kingdom. She thought of the men in the gun shop, of Grimes's greed, of a world that judged everything by its surface. She looked from his face to the sprawling wealth below, and she understood. He had not hidden his poverty. He had hidden his power to protect it from a world that would only seek to devour it. Her shock slowly gave way to a profound sense of recognition. He was a survivor, just like her. He had simply built a better fortress. She did not feel betrayed. She felt seen. "You passed," he said, his gray eyes searching her face in the pale moonlight. She gave a small, slow nod. "So did you." They walked down the winding path toward the house. As they grew closer, the scale of it became even more apparent. It was built to last, a testament to wealth and permanence. The door was thick oak, and when Jonah opened it, it swung inward without a sound. The inside was even more stunning. A great room with a vaulted ceiling, a massive stone fireplace where a whole log was burning, comfortable leather furniture, and shelves filled with books. It was a home filled with warmth, substance, and a deep, abiding peace, a stark, breathtaking contrast to the barren cabin on the ridge. He led her to the fire, taking her cold hands in his. His touch was gentle, hesitant. For the first time, she did not pull away. The warmth from his hands spread through her, a current of life in the frozen landscape of her existence. "You are safe here, Lynn," he said, speaking her name for the first time, the sound soft in the quiet room. She looked up at him, into the depths of his clear gray eyes, and saw not a rich man, but the quiet, steady man she had come to know in the tiny cabin. The man who had offered her shelter without asking for anything in return. The man who had stood with her when danger came. The wealth was just a circumstance. The man was the truth. "I know," she whispered, her own name feeling strange and new on his lips. He did not release her hands. He simply held them, sharing his warmth as they stood before the fire, the ghosts of the outside world finally banished. The soft romance that had been a seedling in the harsh soil of their shared survival now began to bloom in the sudden, startling warmth of this hidden sanctuary. He had built this place to keep the world out, but in testing her, he had found the one person he wanted to let in. And she, who had never had a place to call her own, looked around the magnificent, fire-lit room and realized that home was not a place at all. It was the quiet strength in the hands that held hers. It was the steady presence of a man who had seen the outlaw in her and had offered her not judgment, but belonging. The long winter was not over, but here, in the heart of this secret valley, the thaw had already begun.